Okay, so it's good to see everybody. And I wanted to start today off just to check in if there are any questions from last week's discussion or any questions on how to do the quizzes at all, because there will be one more in a few weeks. So just first, if there are any kind of questions, follow up from our conversation last week. Okay, and just to reiterate again that, the focus that the kind of, research methodologies discussed, again, when we're thinking about things around healing or transformation, mobilization, that these are not end outcomes in themselves. It's thinking about process. And if all of these elements are a continued process, that the methods and methodologies that you're building into your research, how they inform those and help support and further that process. And so it's not that you're going to build methodologies that are going to result in ultimate healing and ultimate transformation, ultimate mobilization. They're part of that ongoing process. And so that was kind of one of the main really takeaways from that, is just thinking about that it's a little bit different than focus just on an end result. We're thinking that of how can the work that you're doing, how can it support and further the community's activities and actions at the time, and that process that they are going through that continually evolves, that continually changes and shifts. And that can be further complex. Say if you're doing work with a community over a great extended period of time, that what you're kind of responding to in the research, that also shifts because their priorities might shift. Things might evolve and change for what's happening based on economic factors, based on what's happening politically, if there's any violence, conflict, if there's a disaster that occurs. There's always these shifts happening that people are responding to. And so the idea is how your methods and methodologies are evolving as well to match where the community's priorities are. And so I want us to think about that too as we move forward and today we'll be talking more on kind of quantitative and mixed research methods, and thinking about work and research that you'd like to engage in, and holding a community group in mind, and keeping in mind that community does not have to equal a geographic space, right? It doesn't have to be, here's this village, here's this neighborhood that I'm working with. A community can also be a group of people connected together somehow. So, for example, if you were really engaged, if you're a football player, right, you might be really engaged with your football team and your football community, right? If you are part of a farming cooperative, that might be farmers from all over, right? They're not bounded by a geographic space. That is a community. If have a religious affiliation, and if you go, say, for example, if you go to a church or a mosque or a synagogue, that is a community. And so when we're talking about community work and community-driven research, that it's not just bounded by a geographic space. There's all different types of communities that can exist even within a geographic community. And so as we kind of hold that in mind and thinking about the type of methods and methodologies that really speak to the type of community engaged work and research that you would want to be participating in. Saying that, I did want to also check in real quick if there were any questions on doing the quizzes, just because there will be one more. As you could see, it wasn't meant to stump you in any way, just kind of also more a check-in for me to see how folks are doing. But if there are any questions on how to do the quizzes moving forward. Okay, so for talking a bit today about the kind of quantitative and mixed research methods. In the short reading you did, and then the videos I asked you to watch, it spoke coming more from some of the videos and looking especially at kind of qualitative versus quantitative. It spoke to kind of trying to define what each of these are. And so let me ask all of you what is kind of your takeaways? What do you see as the purpose of qualitative research? If anyone would like to share. And there's no wrong answers, if that helps.
Well, I was waiting for someone else. I don't know what I'm talking about. I think for me, based on the reading, it's a science coupled with a kind of an art form that's also experiential. So it has the insights that you gain. They have to be measured against quantitative methods, but really, what you really have to do is develop really, really good questions. That's the hardest part. Is that what you were asking?
Well, and that's where we're going with it. So you're leading it in a good direction. Thank you, Robert. And Milshad, I think I saw your hand as well.
Quantitative method about including the community experiences or issues to try to understand in depth how community challenge with experiences.
Exactly. So, and you're cutting up a little, it was a little bit choppy, but you were speaking, it sounded like to ways that you're thinking about meanings of the community's experiences, right? And that is a lot of it, what's at the heart of qualitative research, which links directly to what Robert was sharing about how important that question becomes and how you're framing that question addressing those experiences. So those two responses were beautiful because I didn't plan it, but you were intimately interlinked in that connection. Because really, we think about qualitative research, it's about exploring the meaning of people's experiences, cultures, or a particular issue that they might be focused on. In comparison to the purpose of quantitative research, whereas it's to examine the relationship between variables. And now a variable can be something like a characteristic. And so for anyone who's engaged in quantitative research, do you have examples of what kind of variables that you've used? It's often, it can be two or, sometimes it's more, but kind of to start, a little less complex, thinking about kind of two variables in relation to each other. And so for anyone who has done more quantitative research, can you think of the kinds of variables that you used? Or if you've done a survey and there was a question that you were trying to get at in the survey, what might that question be?
Sorry. Oh, somebody else. We do it all the time in my work, I was gonna say. Can you hear me or is it chopping up? I can type it, okay. Because we can type in the chat. For us, we do it all the time. And one of the things that I did with mountain communities, we would just do surveys as, are you registered for services? Did you know about this and that? So they're very binary type questions. And then it also mixes in qualitative questions later on in different sections or in different surveys, such as how do you feel, how much do you trust this method versus that? How do you feel? And so we use it all the time. The qualitative ones, I feel, need a heck of a lot of work. I think we don't produce such good ones, in my opinion, and we need a lot of work there. There's a lot of surveys that are done for employees that are incredibly bad, and the reason for that is because it seems that someone's already come up with a decision, it feels like, but they're going to use this as, oh, well, we did put it out there and we did take in your surveys. But we still decided this. So I think that the community, and I'll speak for my employee community, is very reluctant to even answer, I would say, in a forthright way. Let me say, not untruthful, but there's a shyness. Like, is this going to matter? Is the answer going to put me at risk for being too honest? But the quantitative, not to get out of the scope, are really rather straightforward. And we do them all the time with the community just to get the numbers. How many people are registered in one section versus, say, the far away sections? Like one thing is how often, one question is, how often do you visit the Boulder office in person? Because the real question they want to answer is, are people really knowing where we are? Did you know there was an outpost over at this other town? Did you know that? Things like that.
Absolutely right. And so that's a great example of these two variables you're looking at, right? One of those variables is asking, are people registered for services? And then you can compare that to another variable being, where are they geographically located? And you can compare those. So you could start to see a trend, right? Maybe people who are closer to the office where they need to register, they have higher rates of being registered for services. So then that tells you something, right, of what do we need to do to reach people who are in more rural, distant locations. Exactly, right. So that's two variables to be looking at. And Robert, what you shared there too about the importance of, while these quantitative questions are give us very measurable metrics, right? You can count it mostly, right? That we also have to be very careful in the framing, because especially in doing a survey, it can be very leading. And I thought about this a lot when they were recently in the schools here. They were doing surveys trying to figure out of getting kids back into school during COVID, and the schools have been shut down. And the problem is the surveys they sent around. So they're saying, oh, we received teacher input, we received parents, guardians input. But the surveys they sent, they kind of, the way that they framed the questions kind of led you into certain responses. And so you could imagine they already have their decision made in a lot of ways. They need to say, okay, we received input based on this input. And so this is where there's a very fine line, and this is why it can be really important to go through your questions and vet them ahead of time, because it's very easy to go cross that line of to like think, a lot of times when we're doing this kind of work, we have a hypothesis in mind. Okay, so for using like the example that Robert gave, right? My hypothesis is telling me that more people are going to be registered for services if they live closer to the office where they need to register. That's my hypothesis. And so because I already have that in mind, it can be very, very easy for me to unintentionally put forward the questions in a way that might lead people into answering and receiving the answers that I think are there. And so this framing of your research question is deeply important. And in a, excuse me, in a qualitative approach, it's a much more exploratory framing. It's questions about what or how. Often, qualitative questions will start with how. Whereas, and so you're kind of on an exploratory path. Whereas quantitative research is much more that hypothesis driven, right? That's as opposed to just saying what or how, it might say how much. It's much more, it's more descriptive in a sense, how much or how often. And it's looking, what's the relationship between X and Y? What's the difference between X and Y? And so we think of kind of that overarching framing, we think of qualitative versus quantitative research is really kind of an exploratory versus hypothesis. It's not to say you won't have a hypothesis in qualitative research, you do, but it's of a much more exploratory nature as opposed to being more bounded, of holding just within, okay, I'm looking for the difference between this and this. I'm looking for the relationship between this and this in a much more bounded way. Whereas the qualitative research question is opening up those boundaries to really explore what the possibilities might be. And
I wanted to ask, apologies. There is, with the quantitative method, there is a possibility to fail from the beginning that is so high. For instance, in my example, you would assume, okay, well, you're right. This radius has all these people, but I had to push myself. This is something I actually did years ago to have a person like me, and after that, it became a group of people, a small group, 3 or 4 people, to go seek out communities that are off the grid. They are not going to answer your electronic surveys. They're not going to get mail. They get their mail in the post office in Boulder once a month or twice a month. How are you capturing the needs of the so-called community if you have all these marginal outliers that are, some of them are homeless camping, which some of them are survivalist types, some of them are off the grid types, some of them are just your straight up hippie communities. Some of them are actually well-off cabin living type of people. And some of them just don't have access to a good internet connection. So when I put this out, they did this because it meant, well, now we have to rethink the whole thing that somebody from IT or somebody had thought about. So they were failing from the get-go, and I wasn't very good back then at writing proposals. I'm still not very good. And so I just get like, very passionate, but that part for me is missing where look, you're not seeing, in other words, I've been training in GIS mapping. And what we're doing with quantitative and qualitative research is mapping in a way. But the map is not the territory, as the saying goes. And you really can fail from the very beginning, just like Lewis and Clark, oh, we're going to find the sea, we're going to find and they never found it because that doesn't exist. So I just wanted to see what your insight is about just the very beginning, just the outset. And I think qualitative, like you said, it's exploratory. We're just going to see what is out there first.
And so that the framing too of setting up to fail at the beginning is a lot of what you're pointing to is one, access, right? And that's something we absolutely have to consider is the mode of getting kind of these instruments out there. So for example, if you are doing a survey, are you doing this online in a place where there's going to be problems with internet connectivity? If you're doing this going house to house, are you doing it at a certain time of day where there's going to be one segment of the population who's not going to be home, or certain people in that household who will never be home? So do you have to consider a varying times of day that you're going around, or evening? And so accessibility is key. And then also in the purpose of it is, are we doing this to reaffirm what we already know? Because a lot of what you're pointing to, right, Robert, is thinking about folks don't want to necessarily be challenged or changed. So if you're thinking about if the work you're doing is to inform an organization, to inform an agency or an institution about, hey, our services aren't reaching this group of people. If they're doing this basically because they have to, right? It's been mandated, oh, okay, we have to reach out and see what this looks like, but we don't really want to change things. So there's a deep element there that's also about the institutional change, right? That's much more internal and less relevant to the research, right? Because what is that institution willing to do with that information received? And so instead of saying, okay, we need to find out who our services are accessing, so we're going to do this survey and find out who it's reaching and who it's missing. But has the conversation been had before that of playing out kind of different scenarios? We talk about sometimes of, instead of a hypothesis, you might think about scenario planning. So a scenario would be, okay, what if we find out our services are not reaching this part of the population? What actions will we take to change and address that? And so an approach to have that kind of internal buy-in, if you will, to be receiving the information and be preparing for shifts that might need to happen, is to do kind of more scenario planning internally with, whether it's an organization you're working with, a nonprofit, a school, an institution, an agency, a conservation group, whomever it might be, of it's that preparing for not just, okay, we're going to see what's told to us, because you run the risk then of, well, they're saying this, but what are we supposed to do about reaching all those folks over there? We don't have the capacity, we don't have the funding, we don't have the ability to make that change. So now they're ignoring the results received because it's the excuse of we can't, right? And sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes those changes require funding and capacity, but if there was planning and preparation ahead of time and running through these kinds of scenarios while you're developing, that's part of the framework that you're doing for the research. So what if we receive this information back? What is going to be our steps of action? Do we need to increase capacity to do that? Do we need to get additional funding to be able to do that? Do we need to change the way that we function? Playing those through to prepare for the different kinds of information that could be received is part of that process. And that's a big problem in that often gets missed. And so often it's, okay, we need to find out how many folks are receiving our services and who we're missing, without necessarily thinking ahead of time, what are we going to do with the results? And what if the results are different than what we imagine them to be? And so that's where you can fold in these other activities with this. It's part of the research in a way, right? Because it's developing these plans of we're developing a plan of action based on the results received, so that it's not just we're not just in response mode, but it's a more proactive mode. Kind of, if that makes sense a bit. That's a fantastic points. And what becomes really important in that too, for the information that you're receiving through, whether you're doing a survey, whether you're doing an interview or holding a focus group, right? When you're asking questions, you have to make sure that we're asking one question at a time, right? Often, and this is what we're going to work on too, as we develop our research questions, often, especially when we're a little bit broad, we end up posing, without realizing it, several questions at once. And so the results are going to be very muddied. And so this is why it's also really important too, to be vetting, to be going through these questions very carefully, very intentionally, that you only want to ask one question at a time. Because otherwise, if you ask 100 people a question that has multiple questions within it, the responses aren't going to make sense, right, together, because people might be responding to different aspects of that question. And so we have to keep things quite tight and simple in a lot of ways, and think about the language being used, right? Are we saying what we actually mean? And and if we're, say, for example, conducting a survey or conducting interviews with a community where there's multiple languages spoken, where if we're doing a survey and there's a lot of the population that maybe can't read or can't read in the language that the survey is written, when we think about it, translation, how is the question being translated? Is it being reinterpreted? Right? Often, I think we've probably have experienced that. If you go to translate something, you're kind of reinterpreting it in your own mind. So it might be, if June says something to me and then I translated it and I translate it to Gunjan, right? What I'm saying might come out different than June's original intention. And so we have to be very careful with all of this, that question is being conveyed in the way it's intended, in the same way across. And so thinking about, one, the language that's spoken, and multiple languages spoken, the people conducting the work with, and then also the actual words being used. And so, for example, a lot of my work is in climate adaptation, and then also in disaster and hazard response. Now, the difficulty in this is if I say mitigation, if I say the word mitigation in the climate change context, that means one very specific, that means I'm talking about, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, right? When I talk about mitigation. If I talk about mitigation in a hazards and disaster context, that actually relates much more to adaptation in a climate context. And so I have to really think about kind of who I'm engaging with and over what, because if I just start saying mitigation between these two different fields, it's going to mean very different things to the groups of people. And so the words that we're using matter tremendously. Oh, sorry, yeah, Robert, I just saw the chat of, results. Results, there's a danger of not having a protocol for being neutral, right? So peer review or an external auditor to oversee the entire study. Yes, and that's where we think about that kind of vetting process, as well as to who is doing that and how. And, sometimes, ideally, if there's ability to bring on an external person or external team to be doing that, if there's not always the capacity to do that or the funding of how that's being kind of done, so it is reaching beyond just the group, and you do have, as best you can, some sort of external review, right? Because say if Melchiad and Georgie and I all work for the same organization and we're putting this study together and sending a survey out, well, if I'm doing the survey questions and I run them by Melchiad and I run them by Georgie, and they'll say, oh yeah, that's what we want to know, that makes sense, right? But we're all engaged in this together, right? So they're not really able to give me a review because they're too internal to it. They're not seeing how it might be perceived from someone outside the situation, from someone outside developing that. And so having that process where you have kind of that outside review of what you're putting together can be incredibly important, so that you do have that neutrality and you're not leading with your questions. You're not already creating the responses you want to receive. And so when we think about also kind of innovative ways to use these methods, we can think about how we might kind of combine qualitative and quantitative. And Robert, you gave a great example where even in a survey, you had, more quantitative questions, more qualitative questions. So that's one way to think about it, right? You have different types of questions even within one instrument, say being the survey. And so that's one kind of mixed approach. Another mixed approach can be, for example, if you put out that survey and you had survey results, right? That's more quantitative and you can more, count the results. They're quite measurable. If you now took a sample, say if you did that survey with 100 people, and you now took a sample of 10 people out of those 100 and had a focus group conversation with them. If you had a storytelling session with them. If you did more open-ended interviews one-on-one with them, it could be building from the quantitative question, but now you're getting into the qualitative component of exploring more, exploring deeper as to, maybe you said that you live here and you can't access our services. So why is that? What are the barriers there? What are the challenges? What might support you being able to do that? You're getting into more of that exploration behind some of that. And so these methods can work very well together if we can look at, say, at times it can be helpful, for example, to start with a survey that's kind of helping to get some sort of baseline information, right? And then we go kind of a deeper level with some of the qualitative methods. And where this can be important, so for example, if you do just a quantitative kind of mapping approach to understand vulnerability to disasters. So say, for example, in the town where I live, if you did just a very quantitative approach based on income, based on topography, based on employment, based on race, ethnicity, all these things, all these factors, if you did a very quantitative approach, the area looks like it's somewhat vulnerable to flooding, to fires, but not intensely. But now the problem with that is that it's looking at the area overall, right? It's taking kind of this broad stroke. Now, if you got into it really and started looking more closely and having and understanding what's going on at a deeper level, you'd see, well, actually, there's neighborhoods that are deeply impacted when it even rains just a little. It floods tremendously, and those neighborhoods happen to be where it's mostly undocumented families, where it's mostly immigrant families and families living under the poverty line. So that's starting to tell you something quite different than that very kind of baseline level. And that's where these approaches can be used together to where, okay, we start to have a general understanding maybe of an area of a population, but is that truly the case? We have kind of a general idea, okay, in general, maybe this area is somewhat vulnerable to flooding and the impacts of it. But now if we take a closer look and use some more of those qualitative approaches, we can now start to see really what's going on at the ground level so that we're also planning accordingly. Lidette, yeah. Oh, you are muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you are, yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, when we try to do a quantitative study, but we want to use as much of open-ended questions, is that when we try to explore more in depth, like you said now, we get the general information, and do we go back with our open-ended questions to understand more of the situation, or do we try to frame it, beforehand, which I think then would be leading when we ask the question. So I'm a bit confused on that issue.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And from what you're saying there, it sounds more like you're doing a mixed method study, that because more often the open-ended questions are giving you more of qualitative input, right? Because say so for example, if you're doing this through a survey and people are writing out their answers of, maybe you're going to have a bunch of questions where it's multiple choice, or it's yes, no, or it's one word. And then you're going to have more of an open-ended question where they're responding and writing maybe 2 or 3 sentences. And so you can still measure those, but it's going to be a very different approach, right? And so the questions you have that are more of the yes, no, true, false, multiple choice, you can kind of crunch the numbers when you analyze that. For the open-ended questions, you can do, and we're going to practice this in a couple of weeks, where we do what's called, have you all gotten into coding at all? And not coding for computers, not coding software, but where you code for qualitative research. So for qualitative responses. So for example, if you have an open-ended question and people have written out 2 or 3 sentences, or they've spoken their response, you take all of that information and you can do what's called coding for it, where you start to develop themes that emerge. And then within the themes, you start to develop sub-themes, and you can basically, you go through and essentially are highlighting and seeing the overlaps between all of those responses coming in. And so you can start to kind of crunch the information, if you will. It's different than counting. If you have, say, true, false, yes, no, multiple choice responses, that's a different kind of measure. You can still get a measurable outcome, but you're getting there in a very different way by letting what people are saying. You kind of, so for example, you would do like a first read through of all the responses, and then someone else does a read through, right? Say if you're working on a team, maybe there's 3 of you. So you might all read through the responses and then have a conversation of seeing, okay, what themes are starting to emerge among these responses. And then you do another read through, right? And you can start literally, circling or highlighting, okay, here's where we're seeing people speak to the themes, right? So you can look, okay, was that actually, did we get the right themes? What did we miss? Often it'll be realizing other themes that are emerging, and you start to see even sub-themes within those, like subtopics. And so you can still do this in a way, especially if you're wanting to do it in a measurable way, you can still do this. So say, for example, you've done these open-ended questions with 100 people, and 60 people in their response, if you were asking them, do they perceive that they're vulnerable to flooding? Just going on that same theme. And if 60 of them say, we're vulnerable to flooding because of our income level, right? That's measurable. They might have said it all a little bit differently, but that's a theme that's emerging. Okay, so there's a theme emerging. The income level equals some sort of vulnerability to flooding. So that's something you can measure. Okay, so 60 people, 60% of them said that there's a relationship there between income level and being vulnerable to the impacts of flooding. And so that's where you can that's more of a mixed method approach, right? Because you're still getting to a measurable outcome or output, but the process is a bit different, as opposed to just counting how many people said yes, how many said no, how many said true or false, how many responded to this multiple choice. You can still get to that kind of idea, but you're going through this more qualitative coding process that's analyzing the data. And this is where asking the right question becomes deeply important, because you could argue that a lot of people will say quantitative data is objective, right? We're not putting ourselves in it, but what people are saying is what the answers are. However, there is a human being creating the questions being asked. So you could argue there's still very much a subjective matter to that, right? That, for example, if I'm developing the survey, I'm asking, right? So I'm in it somehow. It's not just purely objective in the world. And that becomes even more important with the more qualitative questions and these more open-ended questions, because now there's two layers of that. There's me putting out the questions, developing the questions, and now there's me analyzing the results, right? So for the quantitative questions, which I would argue are still not objective, because you have human beings developing the questions, there is an objective approach to kind of measuring the results, in the sense, okay, it's, well, this many people said yes, this many people said no. However, when you're analyzing, doing that coding analysis, you're trying to let the data, those responses, speak for themselves, but you're involved, right? You're saying, here's the themes that are emerging. And now you're saying, here's the sub-themes. And that's why it's really important, again, to be kind of vetting that, to be making sure, asking, if it's possible to have folks external to the group be checking on that. Because again, it could very well be, well, and we do this unintentionally. It's not that we're trying to skew the information, but if there's, research that we're deeply engaged in, and we've been involved with it a long time, and we expect to see certain results. So I expect to see the income level is going to have a relationship with how vulnerable someone is to flooding. That is my expectation. So even if I'm not trying to, or not intending to, when I look at that, and when I look at those responses, I might be biased in pulling out and seeing, oh, look, this is really important. Income level is very important in thinking about how vulnerable someone is to flooding. And it's very important to check on that, and to someone who's more neutral to the process, because we are going to come in with our biases, with what we imagine to be important, what we imagine that the responses will be. And so, especially, if you're doing the research alone, or even if you're doing it with a team, right? If there's, if there's 5 of you working together on this, you're all still internal to the process, right? So if possible, it's always good to go outside of the group, at the very least, that you're kind of checking each other in a sense. So say, if you were going through the responses, you're getting certain results, right? You're seeing certain themes. And then your partner, your colleague and collaborator, they're going through it and they're getting certain themes. And if each person does that, and then you discuss it, right? And is there a consensus around certain themes, right? And so there's ways to do this to try to be more rigorous, right, as possible. And we're never going to completely reduce our biases. We're never going to completely be objective, that we have to understand even a survey is not objective, right? And that it's problematic because often it's taken as such. And so we really have to understand and push ourselves to, even if, if I'm not intending to skew the answers, I'm involved, right? It's not, there's no such thing really as this external researcher outside the situation, right? If you're doing this research, you're there, you're involved, you are shaping it. And so we have to be honest with that. And so this is a big issue, especially in scientific research, right? The scientist is supposed to be this objective observer of letting the data speak for itself, for example. And so you have to really, question that of can we truly be objective? And it's okay, right, if we're not, but we have to be very forthcoming about that. So it's understood how the findings are coming to be.
I think,
And
Professor, that what you're touching on and what you're explaining to us, I mean, it's reflected in physics itself. They're finding out, and they found out many decades ago, that it cannot be a neutral party, that it doesn't exist, that at, we are really forces, everything in reality that we've noticed are different forces, different fields interacting, so that that tree that's beyond here is really not that different than me here. And it seems to me that like the reading focused a lot on Western philosophy, and I was recommending a podcast called Philosophize This because it really in a 30 minutes you get a lot of things that you might have forgotten from college. But our Western approach, and I'd love to hear from some of our folks in anywhere in the world really, beyond the U.S., what their thinking is on it, because it seems like we are really focused on, no, math is going to do it for us, or there is an answer, and it's so flawed, and we're so blindsided by it that we don't realize. It's kind of like that satire where I forget the name of it, but somebody asks a giant computer at the end of the universe, what's the answer to the meaning of life? And it answers, 49 or some number, right? Because it's really that's silly. Why not? Why couldn't it be just that? So I think that objectivity, obviously, we aim to, and she explains it, or the writer explains it just perfectly. We aim to gather not just our experiences, but and our data. But we cannot simply rely on it because it's just a field. It's just a field also. I don't know. I wanted to touch on that.
does anyone have a response to that, or what you'd like to share? Thank you for that, Robert. I'm going to check out that podcast. When these are challenging questions because they challenge our assumptions, right, and our beliefs, and kind of our normative approaches, where we go in thinking, okay, survey, objective, right? We have to this is challenging our own underlying assumptions here. And so this becomes really important when you're kind of developing an approach and the kind of methods you want to be using in your research, of really thinking carefully. It's beyond even just what are the pros and cons of doing. You want to think about that. What are we trying to get at here? Does this really speak more to a quantitative approach, to a qualitative, or to both, to having the mixed methods? You can think of more kind of the pros and cons of that, but then also thinking about, it's really, what is the question we're asking, and what is going to be the most effective way to get there? And oftentimes, not always, often there is some sort of mixed methods approach, even if we think we're doing purely qualitative research. And often there is, even in, say, if we're doing interviews with people, there's often some quantitative method, sorry, some quantitative questions we're asking. So more often than not, there's some element of doing a mixed methods. And so we want to think too is not always think about these things in silos of, okay, we're doing a qualitative study, we're doing a quantitative study. You can also think about how these methods speak to each other and help build off each other. So for example, doing a survey for some sort of baseline information, and then going deeper into that with, focus group or participatory mapping or interviews with those open-ended questions, right? That we don't think of these in these, quantitative and qualitative in isolated silos, that they can be kind of married together and used to build, to go start at one level and go deeper and deeper into the research and really help get at kind of a very precise, more precise place in the data and information that you're trying to understand. And so, I'd encourage you as you think about, oh, maybe our organization, we do quantitative research, or we always do qualitative research, or, and this is where a team approach can be very important of, I know I am not great at writing surveys. Fortunately, my work partner is fantastic at writing surveys, right? So I'm never going to be the one to start it off. I'll blab all day at her about my ideas. Her brain just works. She's originally an engineer. I don't know if that's why, but her brain just works in a very different way than mine, and she can capture this in a survey. And so some of it too is also recognizing, our own strengths, right, and our own places of growth, and thinking about, especially if you're building out a research team as well, that becomes important, right? Of, wow, we don't really have someone on our team who's great at quantitative research. Is that a need here? Is that something we're missing? Do we need to bring those people in? And so that becomes really important also as kind of an internal look as well, as to understanding where are the strengths and growths of the team, and the kind of, and for the kind of research that you're trying to do, and what gaps need to be filled. So saying that, there's one kind of more thing I wanted to get to, but I do want to pause if there are any other kind of questions or thoughts on this for now. And we can certainly continue on this conversation next week as well. Okay, well, in our last couple of minutes, I wanted to bring back up just from the idea that I shared towards the end of last class of, for future generations, was looking at this potential of starting up what the name will probably change, but they're calling kind of a data collections course over the summer, and then a research 2 through the fall, which would basically be taking the your research proposal written for this course, and then actually carrying that out. So conducting the research over the summer into the fall, and then working through kind of the analysis and creating the products for it in the fall term. And so that would be, those would be 2 courses together. You wouldn't do one or the other. You would do both, kind of basically carrying that research through, carrying out the analysis and development of it in the fall. And so together that would be 6 credits for those 2. And so basically, yeah, so taking the proposal for this and pushing it out into actual research. And so, this is something that's kind of been floated as possibilities, seeing if it's of interest to folks. I know the timing can be a little bit tricky, and so it might be something that it'll be, letting folks know in the fall, maybe for next year as well, of wanting to plan ahead. But I did want to put that out there, that if there is interest in that, if you think that you would like to kind of take what you'd be putting together because by the end of this course, the idea is your main project is going to be putting together a research proposal, right? That it's not actually carrying out the research, but you're developing a research proposal. And that if folks would like to carry that on, it's not going to be just a hypothetical, that you're going to develop that research proposal to then actually conduct the research and carry it forward through the fall. And so if that's an interest to anyone, I'll be staying on after class, so my office hours. I also want to remind, just at a schedule change in my work schedule, that my office hours will be right after this course, which actually probably easier for all of you maybe, so I hope that's the case. So basically I'll just be staying on after the course, or after our session ends too. So if anyone would like to discuss that, you're welcome to stay on. And you know, if that's of an interest. And then just let you know that for next week, we're starting to get into the ethics, methods, and writing portion. Please note there's 2 readings that I've posted. Again, some of these I've put up like the entire books for, okay? And so it's very important to pay attention. If you see a reading that looks like hundreds of pages, go back to the instructions and look at the specific page numbers that I'm suggesting to read. Okay, for some of these, I just figured, well, you know, it might be a nice resource to have the full book if you want to look through things at all, or longer sections. But you can pretty much bet if there's a reading you open up and it's like 100 or more pages, go back to the instructions, and I have very specific page numbers that I'm asking you to look through. And you're of course welcome to look through more of that if you so desire. And then we will have the community discussion forum for next Monday, Monday evening university time. And I will be getting the prompt for that posted within the next couple hours. So I will send a message out again in the next couple hours for the process coming up for the next week, and then also alerting you to the prompt being up for your discussion forum. So with that, if anyone is interested in in the data collection and research 2 courses, you're welcome to stay on. Otherwise, I will see you all next Thursday.